The autumn wind carried the scent of caramel apples and diesel fuel through downtown Portland's Pioneer Square. Marcus felt it first as a chill down his spine. Then the world shifted. In his mind's eye, he saw the massive Ferris wheel groaning, metal bolts snapping like gunshots. The screaming began before the collapse, a sound that would haunt him forever. When reality snapped back, Sarah was shaking his shoulder. "Marcus, you look like you've seen a ghost." The fair's neon lights flickered ominously ahead. Marcus stood frozen at the entrance of the Harvest Moon Fair, his hands trembling as the vision replayed in crystalline detail. The massive Ferris wheel, a towering monument of steel and flashing lights, dominated the fairgrounds like a sleeping giant. In his premonition, he'd seen it all. The third support beam buckling at exactly 9:47 p.m. The screams of families trapped in swaying gondolas. The sickening crunch of metal against pavement. "Come on, man, what's wrong?" Jake's voice cut through the cacophony of carnival music and delighted shrieks from nearby rides. The burly construction worker had seen that look before. Marcus always got weird when his intuition kicked in. Sarah tugged at Marcus's sleeve, her eyes bright with excitement. "The lines aren't too bad yet. We could hit the Ferris wheel first and get the best view of the city." She pointed toward the towering attraction, its gondola swaying gently in the Pacific Northwest breeze. "No." The word escaped Marcus's lips with more force than intended. Both his friends turned to stare at him, concern replacing their earlier enthusiasm. The smell of funnel cake and cigarette smoke from the crowd felt overwhelming, mixing with the acrid scent of machine oil from the rides. "Dude, seriously, what's gotten into you?" Jake crossed his arms, his weathered face creased with worry. "You've been acting strange since we parked." Marcus's analytical mind raced, trying to process what he'd experienced. As a software engineer, he lived in a world of logic and code, where every problem had a rational solution. But this feeling, this absolute certainty of impending disaster defied all reasoning. He'd felt it twice before in his life. Once before a multi-car pileup on Highway 101 that he'd narrowly avoided, and another time before a gas explosion in his old apartment building that had evacuated everyone just minutes before the blast. "The Ferris wheel," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the carnival noise. "Something's going to happen to it." Tonight, Sarah laughed nervously, her breath visible in the crisp October air. "Marcus, honey, you're scaring me. It's just a carnival ride." They inspect these things constantly. But Marcus shook his head, his dark eyes fixed on the slowly rotating wheel. Even from this distance, he could see families climbing into the brightly painted gondolas, children pressing their faces against the windows in wonder. In his vision, he'd seen their faces change from joy to terror in a matter of seconds. The fairgrounds buzzed with typical weekend energy. Teenagers clutched oversized stuffed animals won at ring toss games. Parents chased toddlers, sticky with cotton candy, and the air filled with the mechanical symphony of spinning rides and electronic game sounds. Portland's downtown skyline glittered beyond the temporary structures, creating a postcard-perfect backdrop that made the impending disaster seem even more impossible. "Listen to me." Marcus grabbed both of his friends by the arms, his grip urgent. "We need to leave, now, and we need to convince as many people as we can to get away from that wheel." Jake studied his friend's face, noting the pale complexion and the way Marcus's pupils had dilated despite the bright carnival lights. In all their years of friendship, he'd never seen Marcus this shaken. "All right, let's say I believe you. What exactly did you see?" The memory hit Marcus like a physical blow. 9:47 p.m. The third support beam, the one with the faded yellow paint stripe, it fails first. The whole structure tilts toward the food court area. The people in the gondolas, ... He swallowed hard, unable to finish the sentence. Sarah checked her phone screen. It's 9:20 now. "Marcus, this is crazy. You can't predict the future." "I know how it sounds," Marcus said, his voice gaining strength. "But I also know what I saw. Please, just trust me on this." The trio moved through the crowd like salmon swimming upstream, Marcus's urgency infectious despite his friend's skepticism. The Harvest Moon Fair sprawled across 3 city blocks, a temporary maze of attractions that had drawn thousands of Portland residents on this crisp Saturday evening. Strings of Edison bulbs cast warm pools of light between the shadows, while the distant sound of a bluegrass band competed with electronic game music. "Excuse me." Marcus approached a family of 4 heading toward the Ferris wheel. Their youngest child, a girl of maybe 6, clutching a rainbow-colored pinwheel. "I wouldn't recommend the Ferris wheel tonight. Maybe try the carousel instead?" The father, a bearded man in a flannel shirt that screamed local, gave Marcus a suspicious look. "Why? Is there something wrong with it?" Marcus's throat went dry. How do you explain a supernatural premonition to a stranger without sounding insane? I work in safety inspection," he lied, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. There were some concerns earlier about wind conditions. Sarah shot him a sharp look, but said nothing. Jake, meanwhile, had wandered toward the Ferris wheel's control booth, his construction background drawing him to examine the massive bolts and support structures. The bearded father looked up at the clear October sky, then back at Marcus with growing suspicion. "Wind conditions? It's barely breezy." Before Marcus could respond, a teenager manning a nearby ring toss game called out, "Hey, don't listen to him. That guy's been trying to scare people away from the rides all night. Probably works for the competition fair across town." Heat flooded Marcus's cheeks as several nearby families turned to stare. The accusation struck him like a physical blow, not because it was true, but because it revealed how desperate and irrational he must appear to strangers. "That's not," he started, but the bearded father was already steering his family away, muttering something about weird city people. Jake jogged back from his inspection, his face grim. "Marcus, I hate to say this, but everything looks solid. I've worked construction for 8 years, and those support beams are great as steel. The bolts are properly torqued, the foundation looks stable, and there's no visible metal fatigue." The words hit Marcus like a sledgehammer. His best friend's professional opinion directly contradicted his supernatural certainty, creating a cognitive dissonance that made his head spin. Around them, the carnival continued its cheerful chaos, children shrieking with delight on the tilt-a-whirl, couples sharing caramel apples, teenagers trying to impress each other at the strength test game. 9:35, Sarah announced, checking her phone again. 12 minutes until your prediction, assuming you're right." Marcus watched helplessly as more families climbed aboard the Ferris wheel. Each gondola that filled with passengers felt like another weight on his conscience. What if he was wrong? What if his stressed mind had conjured this vision from too many horror movies and not enough sleep? But what if he was right, and his inability to convince people would result in a tragedy he could have prevented? The smell of kettle corn and cigarettes mingled with the October air, creating an oddly comforting aroma that reminded Marcus of childhood visits to the Oregon State Fair. But tonight, even familiar scents felt ominous, as if the entire world had shifted into a minor key. "Look," Jake said, placing a heavy hand on Marcus's shoulder. "I've got an idea. Why don't we go grab some coffee and watch from a distance? If something happens, which it won't, we'll be the first to call 911. If nothing happens, you owe me a funnel cake and an explanation for this whole freak out." It wasn't the solution Marcus wanted, but it was better than standing helplessly in the crowd. They found a bench near the fair's perimeter, close enough to observe the Ferris wheel, but far enough away to avoid the worst of the chaos should his prediction come true. As they settled onto the cold metal bench, Marcus's phone buzzed with a text from his sister in Seattle. "How's the fair? Send pics." The normalcy of the message felt surreal given the circumstances. Around them, Portland's nightlife continued, unaware traffic humming along the nearby streets. Apartment windows glowing with warm light. The distant sound of music from the trendy bars in the Pearl District. 9:42, Sarah whispered, her voice tight with a tension she was trying to hide. Marcus stared at the Ferris wheel, now fully loaded with passengers. The gondolas swayed gently in the evening breeze, their occupants pointing at the city lights and taking selfies. Everything looked perfectly normal, perfectly safe. For the first time since his vision, Marcus began to doubt himself. Maybe Jake was right. Maybe his stressed mind had created this elaborate fantasy. Maybe. The first metallic groan cut through the carnival noise like a knife. The sound was subtle at first, a low, grinding moan that most fairgoers dismissed as normal mechanical noise. But Marcus felt it in his bones, a deep vibration that matched exactly what he'd experienced in his vision. His entire body went rigid, every muscle coiled with anticipation. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, gripping the bench so hard his knuckles went white. Jake cocked his head, his construction-trained ears parsing the sounds of the fair. "Hear what?" "The rides always make noise, man." But Sarah had noticed Marcus's reaction, and now she was listening too. The Ferris wheel continued its steady rotation, its cheerful carnival music playing the same loop it had been cycling through all evening. Families waved from the gondolas, their faces illuminated by the colorful lights strung throughout the structure. Marcus checked his phone. 9:45 p.m. 2 minutes. "We need to call someone," he said, fumbling for his phone. "The fire department, police, someone who can stop the ride." "And tell them what?" Sarah's voice carried a note of hysteria she was trying to suppress. "That your psychic boyfriend thinks the Ferris wheel is going to collapse in 2 minutes?" Around them, the fair continued its oblivious celebration. A group of college students stumbled past, laughing loudly at some shared joke. The smell of grilled onions from a nearby food truck made Marcus's stomach clench with nausea. How could the world feel so normal when disaster lurked just moments away? Another groan, this one louder and more prolonged. Several people near the Ferris wheel looked up, their expressions shifting from joy to mild concern. A mother clutched her toddler closer as the sound repeated, a metal-on-metal screech that seemed to emanate from the wheel's base. Jake was on his feet now, his professional instincts overriding his skepticism. "That's not normal," he muttered, squinting at the massive structure. "That sounds like structural stress." The ride operator, a thin man in a grease-stained t-shirt, had also noticed the sounds. Marcus watched him walk around the base of the Ferris wheel, checking connections and listening to the machinery with growing concern. The man pulled out a walkie-talkie and spoke into it, but his words were lost in the carnival noise. 9:46 p.m. 1 minute. Marcus stood up, his legs shaky with adrenaline. "I'm going to try one more time," he said, already moving toward the crowd. "I can't just sit here and watch." He pushed through the throng of people, ignoring the annoyed looks and muttered complaints. The Ferris wheel loomed above him like a giant spider web, its lights creating hypnotic patterns against the dark sky. The gondolas swayed more noticeably now, and he could see concerned faces peering down from the highest seats. "Please," he shouted to anyone who would listen. "Get away from the wheel. Something's wrong." A security guard in a yellow reflective vest approached him, radio crackling. "Sir, you need to calm down. You're disturbing the other guests. Look at the third support beam." Marcus pointed frantically at the structure. "Can't you see it's buckling?" The guard followed his gaze, and for a moment, Marcus thought he saw recognition flash across the man's features. The beam did look different, not obviously damaged, but somehow wrong, as if the metal had begun to warp under invisible pressure. 9:47 p.m. The sound, when it came, was like the world breaking. Not the clean snap of a twig or the crash of thunder, but something deeper and more final. The grinding of metal teeth that had been holding back catastrophe, finally giving way to physics and fate. Marcus felt the vibration through his feet first, a tremor that seemed to rise from the earth itself. Then came the screaming, not from the crowd, but from the metal, as if the Ferris wheel were a living thing crying out in its death throes. The third support beam, exactly as he'd seen in his vision, began to bend with agonizing slowness. The entire structure tilted just a few degrees at first, but enough to send the gondola swaying violently. The passengers' delighted screams turned to genuine terror as they realized something was very wrong. "Run!" Marcus screamed, his voice hoarse with desperation. "Get away from it!" This time, people listened. The crowd scattered like startled birds, parents scooping up children, teenagers abandoning their games and prizes. The security guard was already on his radio, calling for emergency services with practiced efficiency. But Marcus knew it was too late for some. The wheel was falling, exactly as he'd foreseen, its massive weight carrying it toward the food court area, where dozens of people had been enjoying late-night snacks just moments before. He ran with the crowd, Sarah's hand clutched in his, Jake somewhere behind them in the chaos. The sound of destruction followed them, metal screaming, concrete cracking, the desperate cries of those who hadn't escaped in time. When they finally stopped running and turned back, the scene looked exactly like his vision. But instead of relief at being right, Marcus felt only hollow horror at the tragedy he'd witnessed but couldn't prevent. The immediate aftermath passed in a blur of emergency lights and chaos. Fire trucks, ambulances, and police cars converged on the fairgrounds with sirens wailing, their red and blue lights painting the disaster scene in stark, intermittent brightness. The collapsed Ferris wheel lay sprawled across the food court like a fallen giant, its colorful gondolas scattered like broken toys. Marcus, Sarah, and Jake found themselves pressed against the police barriers with hundreds of other evacuated fairgoers, watching paramedics and rescue workers swarm the wreckage. The smell of diesel exhaust from emergency vehicles mixed with the acrid scent of twisted metal and spilled cooking oil from the damaged food stands. Preliminary reports suggest 17 injured, 3 in critical condition. A news reporter spoke into her microphone nearby, her voice carrying over the crowd. The cause of the structural failure is still under investigation, but witnesses report hearing unusual sounds from the ride minutes before the collapse. Sarah squeezed Marcus's hand so tightly it hurt. She hadn't spoken since they'd stopped running, her face pale with shock. Jake stood behind them, his construction worker's eyes studying the wreckage with professional interest mixed with horror. "How did you know?" Jake finally asked, his voice barely audible above the emergency radio chatter. "I mean, really, how did you know exactly what was going to happen?" Marcus shook his head, unable to find words. The vision had felt so real, so immediate, that experiencing the actual collapse felt almost anticlimactic. Like watching a movie he'd already seen, except with real blood and real screams echoing in his memory. Hours later, after giving their statements to police and paramedics, the 3 friends sat in an all-night diner on Burnside Street. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across their faces, and the coffee tasted bitter and overbrewed. Outside, Portland's late-night traffic hummed past the windows, the city continuing its normal rhythm despite the tragedy just blocks away. "I keep thinking about the families," Sarah whispered, stirring sugar into her untouched coffee. "The little girl with the pinwheel. Did she—" "The news said most people got out," Marcus replied, though the words felt hollow. He'd seen the paramedics working frantically on several victims, their professional calm unable to hide the severity of the injuries. Jake's phone buzzed with a text from his supervisor at the construction company. Word was already spreading through the industry about the fair accident, and investigators would be examining every bolt and beam for signs of metal fatigue or improper installation. "The weird thing is," Jake said slowly, "I inspected that structure myself tonight. Everything looked perfect. Code-compliant, properly installed, regular maintenance records. There was no reason for it to fail." Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October night. What are you saying? I'm saying maybe some things can't be explained by engineering standards and safety protocols. Jake met his friend's eyes across the table. Maybe you saw something that hadn't happened yet but was always going to happen. The diner's neon sign flickered outside, casting irregular patterns of light across their faces. In the distance, Marcus could still hear sirens, probably ambulances heading to the hospital with the injured. The sound made his stomach clench with guilt and helplessness. They drove back to Marcus's apartment in the Pearl District in Jake's pickup truck, the radio playing soft jazz that felt inappropriately peaceful. Sarah fell asleep against Marcus's shoulder in the passenger seat, her breathing finally steady after hours of stress and adrenaline. But as they pulled into the parking garage beneath Marcus's building, he heard it for the first time. The faint sound of carnival music, tinny and distant, like an old music box winding down. He looked around the concrete garage, but there was no obvious source for the sound. Did you guys hear that? He asked, but Jake was already getting out of the truck, and Sarah was stirring awake, disoriented and groggy. The elevator ride to the 12th floor was silent except for the mechanical hum of cables and gears. But as the doors opened onto his hallway, Marcus heard it again. Carnival music, mixed with the distant laughter of children and the electronic beeping of arcade games. His apartment felt too quiet after the chaos of the evening. Sarah collapsed onto his couch without changing clothes, exhaustion finally overcoming the adrenaline that had kept her alert for hours. Jake accepted the offer to crash on the air mattress rather than drive home to his place in southeast Portland. But Marcus couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the Ferris wheel collapsing in slow motion, heard the screams of the passengers trapped in the gondolas. Worse than the visual memories were the sounds that seemed to follow him, the grinding of metal, the carnival music, the delighted shrieks that turned to terror. At 3:17 a.m., he gave up on sleep and made coffee, standing at his kitchen window looking out at the city lights. Portland spread out below him like a circuit board, its streets and buildings creating patterns of light and shadow that normally calmed his analytical mind. But tonight, even the familiar view felt wrong. In the distance, toward the fairgrounds, he could swear he saw lights moving in patterns that resembled a Ferris wheel, turning slowly against the dark sky. The carnival music was getting louder. Monday morning arrived gray and drizzling, typical Pacific Northwest weather that matched Marcus's mood perfectly. He'd managed maybe 2 hours of sleep total, and those had been filled with dreams of spinning wheels and screaming metal. Sarah had left early for work, kissing him goodbye with worried eyes that promised they'd talk later about what had happened. At his office in a sleek downtown building, Marcus tried to focus on code reviews and system architecture, but concentration proved impossible. Every mechanical sound, the hum of the air conditioning, the whir of computer fans, even the elevator's cables, reminded him of the Ferris wheel's death throes. Rough weekend? His colleague Janet stopped by his cubicle with a steaming cup of coffee, her usually cheerful demeanor subdued. I saw the news about the fare accident. Terrible thing. Marcus nodded without looking up from his monitor, where lines of Python code blurred together into meaningless symbols. Yeah, we were there when it happened. God, that must have been terrifying. Were you guys close to it when it collapsed? Close enough. The conversation felt surreal, like discussing a movie he'd watched rather than a tragedy he'd lived through. How could he explain that he'd seen it happen before it actually occurred? That he'd failed to save people despite having advance warning? The morning dragged by with agonizing slowness. During his lunch break, Marcus walked to Pioneer Square, drawn by a morbid curiosity to see the fairgrounds in daylight. The cleanup crews had worked through the night, but evidence of the disaster remained. Deep gouges in the concrete where metal had scraped, scattered debris that the workers had missed, wilted flowers left by morning visitors. The space felt haunted even in broad daylight. Without the carnival's colorful chaos, The empty lot looked like a crime scene, which Marcus supposed it was. Yellow police tape still cordoned off sections where investigators continued their work, photographing debris and measuring angles. But as he stood there, Marcus heard it again. Faint carnival music drifting on the wind, mixed with the sound of children's laughter. He spun around, looking for the source, but saw only cleanup crews and investigators going about their grim work. "Excuse me." He approached one of the workers, a middle-aged woman in a hard hat and reflective vest. "Is there another fair nearby? I keep hearing music." She looked at him with the patient expression of someone who dealt with disaster tourists all morning. "No other fairs in the area, hon." "Sometimes the wind carries sounds from the waterfront, though. Maybe that's what you're hearing." But Marcus knew it wasn't wind-carried music from the distant waterfront. The melody was too specific, too familiar. The same cheerful tune the Ferris wheel had played on Saturday night, now turned sinister by association. He returned to work, but couldn't shake the feeling that something was following him. In the elevator, he heard the faint grinding of metal that sounded exactly like the wheel's support beam failing. In the bathroom, children's laughter echoed off the tile walls. Even his computer seemed to hum with a rhythm that matched the Ferris wheel's rotation. By evening, Marcus felt like he was losing his mind. Sarah noticed his distraction over dinner at their favorite Thai restaurant. How he kept glancing around the dining room, as if searching for something only he could perceive. "You're hearing it again, aren't you?" she said quietly, setting down her pad thai untouched. "The carnival sounds." He nodded, grateful that she believed him, even when he wasn't sure he believed himself. "It's getting louder, more persistent. Maybe you should talk to someone. A therapist, I mean. What you went through, what we all went through. It was traumatic. Having auditory hallucinations afterward isn't uncommon." Marcus wanted to agree with her rational explanation, but deep in his gut, he knew this wasn't trauma-induced psychosis. The sounds weren't random or chaotic like typical hallucinations. They were specific, purposeful, almost like a message he couldn't decode. That night, sleep proved impossible. Every time Marcus dozed off, he was jolted awake by carnival music or the sound of grinding metal. By 2 a.m., he gave up and made coffee, settling into his living room chair with a book he couldn't focus on reading. The sounds were louder now, clear enough that he wondered how Sarah could sleep through them. Carnival music mixed with children's laughter, the electronic beeping of arcade games, and underneath it all, the rhythmic grinding of a massive wheel turning against failing bearings. At 3:17 a.m. same time, he'd been awakened the night before. Marcus heard something new, his own voice, calling out warnings that no one had heeded. "Get away from the wheel. Something's wrong." The words echoed through his apartment as if spoken by a ghost of his past self. He walked to the window, looking out at Portland's sleeping cityscape. In the distance, toward the fairgrounds, lights moved in a slow, hypnotic pattern. Not the random flicker of traffic or building lights, but the deliberate rotation of a Ferris wheel that no longer existed. As he watched, Marcus realized with growing horror that the phantom wheel was turning faster than it should, its lights blurring together into streams of color against the dark sky. The carnival music grew louder, more insistent, as if trying to tell him something he was failing to understand. The fair wasn't finished with him yet. Tuesday brought no relief. Marcus called in sick to work, unable to face another day of pretending normalcy, while carnival music played in his head like a broken record. The sounds had grown so persistent that he'd started responding to them, answering the children's laughter with shushes, flinching at every metallic groan as if the Ferris wheel were collapsing again and again in an endless loop. Sarah found him that evening sitting on his apartment's balcony, staring toward the downtown area where the fairgrounds lay empty. She'd brought Chinese takeout, but the smell of food made his stomach turn. "Marcus, you look terrible." She knelt beside his chair, her face etched with worry. "When's the last time you ate something?" He couldn't remember. Time had become fluid. marked only by the rise and fall of phantom carnival music and the grinding of ghostly machinery. "It's getting stronger," he whispered. I think it wants me to come back." "What wants you to come back?" Marcus turned to look at her, and Sarah gasped at what she saw. His eyes were hollow, ringed with dark circles that made him look like a different person entirely. "The fair. It's not finished." Saturday night was just the beginning. She sat down beside him, taking his hands in hers. They felt cold despite the warm evening air. "Honey, there is no fair anymore. It was a traveling carnival, and they've already packed up and moved on to the next city. The insurance investigators finished their work yesterday." But Marcus shook his head. "Not that fair. The real one. The one that never leaves." As if summoned by his words, the carnival music swelled around them, loud enough that Marcus was certain Sarah must hear it now. But her expression remained concerned rather than startled, confirming what he'd begun to suspect. The sounds were meant for him alone. That night, Marcus made a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. At 3:17 a.m., when the phantom wheel's lights were brightest and the music most insistent, he dressed quietly and left his sleeping apartment. Sarah lay curled on his couch, exhausted by days of worry and sleepless nights. Portland's streets were empty, except for the occasional taxi or late-night delivery truck. The air still held October's crisp promise of winter. But to Marcus, it felt charged with electricity, as if reality itself were thin enough to tear. He walked toward downtown, following a melody only he could hear. The carnival music grew louder with each step, joined by the electronic beeping of games and the delighted screams of children on rides. By the time he reached Pioneer Square, the sounds were overwhelming, a cacophony of joy and terror that made his head pound. The fairgrounds were dark and empty, surrounded by chain-link fencing that hadn't been there during the day. But as Marcus approached, he could see them clearly. The rides, the game booths, the food stands, all exactly as they'd been on Saturday night. The Ferris wheel stood tall and proud, its lights painting rainbow patterns across his face. "You came back," said a voice behind him. Marcus turned to see the ride operator from Saturday night, the thin man in the grease-stained t-shirt. But his face was different now, not quite solid, like looking at someone through water. "You tried to save them," the man continued, his voice echoing strangely. "But some things can't be changed. Some wheels have to turn." "I don't understand," Marcus whispered, though part of him was beginning to. The operator gestured toward the Ferris wheel, where Marcus could now see figures in the gondolas, the same families who'd been trapped on Saturday night, still riding, still trying to escape a fate that had already claimed them. "Every fair needs someone to remember," the operator explained. "Someone to carry the stories forward. You saw what was going to happen because you were chosen to witness it. But witnessing isn't enough." Marcus felt a pull toward the wheel, stronger than gravity, more inevitable than time. The carnival music was beautiful now, not terrifying, filled with the laughter of children who would never grow old, and the joy of families frozen in their final moments of happiness. "The wheel turns," the operator said, his voice growing distant. "It always turns. And sometimes it needs someone to help it remember how." Marcus walked toward the Ferris wheel, each step feeling like coming home. The Phantom Fair welcomed him with open arms, its lights and sounds embracing him like an old friend. As he climbed into an empty gondola, he felt the weight of Saturday night's tragedy lifting from his shoulders. The wheel began to turn, slowly at first, then faster. Below him, Portland's lights blurred into streams of color, and the carnival music swelled into a symphony of eternal celebration. Marcus closed his eyes and let himself become part of the fair's endless rotation, a guardian of memories that would never fade. Sarah found his apartment empty the next morning, his bed unslept in, his phone and wallet left behind on the kitchen counter. The police search found no trace of him, no evidence of where he might have gone or why. But sometimes, on quiet October nights when the wind carries the scent of caramel apples and diesel fuel, Portland residents report hearing faint carnival music drifting through the downtown streets. And those who listen closely say they can hear a voice among the sounds, a young man calling out warnings about wheels that turn and fates that cannot be changed. The fair never truly leaves. It just waits for the next person who can see what others cannot, who can hear the music that plays between the seconds, who understands that some stories are too important to die.